Welcome, welcome. In this video, we'll be talking about the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. This will not be a long video compared to the two intro videos for today, but I do just want to briefly cover some of the major points in the general prologue. So again, you'll want some note-taking materials and the Canterbury Tales, which starts on page 1701. Now, in the last video, recall that I asked you to pay attention to the descriptions of the pilgrims and also to pay attention to the ways in which Chaucer is sort of playing with the kind of limits of social class, playing with these conceptions of, who belongs to what class, especially based on the language that each character uses. So, first, in the prologue, we are introduced to the frame narrative, because that's how frame narratives work, and this narrative the frame, the kind of overall story starts off with a little joke. And that's that, when that April with his when April with his shower suite, chases away the dreary March, that's when people get really antsy, they want to go on pilgrimage. So the story is implying that, once April gets here and, brings all these fresh spring rains and the flowers start blooming and the dreary kind of dry March goes away, that people get really antsy, they want to be outside, and they want to travel. But the little joke here is that April was considered a terrible time for traveling for exactly this reason, right? When April starts raining, all of the roads get muddy. It's a terrible time for traveling. You don't want to be traveling in the rain. That's awful. So immediately the narrative starts us off with a little joke. And not only is it a little joke, a springtime opening like this one generally indicates during this time period that the story about to be told is a romance. So by starting the story with a description of a springtime setting, Chaucer is indicating to his audience to expect a romance or something romance adjacent. Which, if you've read the prologue, or if you're familiar with the story, you know that's not really the case. Like, there are some romances in the Canterbury Tales, but it's not a romance. So here's our cast of characters. I'm not going to read them all, but I have taken the time to bold all of the characters from whom we do not get stories. So here are all the characters we do get stories from. And then we get a plowman story in later manuscripts, but the plowman's tale is unlikely to be an original kind of Chaucer edition. But you can see we're working with just a ton of people. And if you look, we've got people from all walks of life. We have people who are part of the clergy, we have doctors, we have people who are part of the nobility, we have people who, are craftsmen and tradesmen. We have people who are just people, the wife of Bath. So we really have people from all walks of life represented in this text. And as you may recall, hopefully, because I just mentioned it literally in the last video, they're off to see the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Now, it is worth pointing out that Becket's shrine had become famous for its ability to heal the sinful, or those with colorful pasts. St. Thomas Becket had been killed in 1170. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury during the reign of Henry II, and they had been extremely good friends until they had a really big argument. And Becket was known for being very opinionated and very kind of grumpy. He was known to be a grumpy man, and so after he and Henry had their falling out, some of Henry's knights took it in their heads to go and kill Thomas for the king. Now, remember that Henry and Thomas had been best friends. So they went to where Becket lived, and they went into the church where they found him preparing for the next service, and they killed him in the church. And if you know anything about medieval religion or medieval law, or even modern law, you know that killing someone in a church was one of the worst sins that you could commit. Now, Henry didn't order his death, but he did, through their argument, sort of cause it, and so he had to go through a great deal of penance before he could be forgiven by the church. But he also suffered very much personally because he and Becket had been so close, and he mourned Becket's death very strongly. But because Becket was killed in the church by some knights, he was almost immediately canonized by the Catholic Church, so he became a saint just within a few years of his death. And it's partially because of his reputation as being a stubborn, cranky old man that his shrine his gravesite had become famous for its ability to heal the sinful, or the stubborn, or those with colorful pasts, or people who were a little bit just kind of off of society in general. So consider that story and consider Becket's reputation as you're thinking about who these characters are, right? If they're all going to Thomas Becket's shrine, what might that imply about each one of them? So the narrator provides a description of each of the company in turn, noting their station, their status, their clothing, as well as some nuggets of information about them as people that someone who was actually traveling with them wouldn't necessarily know about them. So immediately we kind of understand that the point of view of the narrator is a little bit more omniscient, right? The narrator knows things about the characters that if the narrator were just another character, they wouldn't know. So right away we see that this narrator figure is not a self-insert character of Chaucer's, and the narrator is obviously not just Chaucer, but does occupy sort of a space in between real Chaucer and character Chaucer. So the narrator's descriptions of each character contains praises for them, and interestingly, it also praises their kind of less ethical activities. He'll go so far as to say, like, this person is really good at swindling, and that's awesome. Or, this person is more wealthy than they should be for their station in life, but they look great. So it's up to us, the readers, to determine whether Chaucer's narrator is being genuine in his praise. Like, is he being hyperbolic? Is he being sarcastic and actually criticizing these characters? Is he praising them for doing the best they can, within their social context? It's really up to us to sort of puzzle out what Chaucer's narrator is doing here. And because of the cast of characters contains such a vast spread across English social stratas, like because we get nobility, we get farmers, we get tradespeople, we get clergy, because we get a little bit of everything, there used to be this really common argument for these characters being more like archetypes or almost stereotypes of their social classes rather than being like proper characters. And this is a more allegorical reading that implies that Chaucer was making a kind of broad comment on each type of person based on their standing. Almost that he was making kind of a stereotypical observation like, oh, all nuns are like this, all millers are like this. But on the other hand, Chaucer moves between styles and dictions for each character. He doesn't pin each character onto a stereotype of their perceived status. So an example of this would be later when we read The Miller's Tale, you'll see that he uses a really wide range of rhetorical and storytelling strategies, while The Knight's Tale, the knight's vocabulary is surprisingly limited. So what you're getting is when he makes these criticisms or when he writes these characters and the way that they speak and act, he is doing it in such a way that it makes this reading of these characters as like stereotypes or archetypes not hold a lot of water. Like this argument doesn't hold a lot of water because of the way that Chaucer doesn't just assign a stereotyped set of attributes to them. He lets them be very fully fleshed out characters who often say and do surprising things. So this doesn't necessarily mean that Chaucer was like an early adopter of democracy or something. It just means that he either was interested in sort of the murky reality of class distinctions during his time period, or that, he was more invested in his characters as real people than he was interested in them as stereotypes. It could also be both. Maybe he was kind of trying to understand his changing social landscape, but he also just wanted to write good, fully fleshed out characters. He can be doing both. And I'd be interested to see what you think about this. Do you think that these characters are very stereotyped? Do you think that he is making a social commentary about the way that the world around him is changing? Do you think that he just wants to write good characters? Do you think but what do you think? So, as they travel, the host who gets a name, the host gets a name. Not everyone in the story gets a whole name. In fact, most characters don't. But the host's name is Harry Bailey, and he suggests, once they're all together, that they have a storytelling competition. He says that the traveler who tells the story with the, quote, best sentence and most solace will win a free meal paid for by the other pilgrims when they get back to the inn. Now, this phrase, sentence and solace, are really important in Middle English literature. They come up all the time. And there's no direct translation for either of them. But the best way to think about them is to focus on more of a vibe. And the vibe of sentence is kind of, if you think about, like in court today, like if you receive a sentence, it has often to do with a perceived failing of yours. Like, you go to traffic court and you are sentenced to driving school. Sentence has to do with like moral education. It's this concept of like, is this story a good example to follow? Does this story have like a moral that we can take from it? Does this story teach us something? But none of those are direct translations. So sentence is just kind of a vibe or a sense of like, is this story good for you? And then solace is actually the word where we get solace from, but don't think of solace as being like comfort. Again, there's no good direct translation, but solace is more of a vibe of like enjoyment or merriment or, is this story a good time? So essentially Harry Bailey is saying, the story that is both the most morally instructive and also the most entertaining will get you a free meal when we get back to the inn. So much has been made of Harry Bailey's place in the story because he is the adjudicator of the contest. He's one of the only named characters. He also functions as a kind of editor. We'll see him really butting into some people's stories later in the text. And so he almost functions as like the inciting incident of the plot. There would always be, had he not come up with this story, they would still be traveling to Canterbury. They would still be on this pilgrimage, but they wouldn't necessarily be telling these stories unless Harry Bailey had said, hey, we should tell stories. So it's fascinating that more even than the fictionalized Chaucer insert narrator does, it's Harry Bailey who kind of creates the story. It's Harry Bailey who creates the opportunity to have this compendium of stories being told. So I'm interested again to find out from you all, where else do you see this layering of authorship and authority? Who is creating space to tell stories? Who is deciding what stories get told? Who is deciding what stories are worth telling? And who is deciding where these stories come from, right? Like, who gets to tell them? Where do they come from? Are they true stories? Are they worth telling? Do they have merit? Do they have sentence and solace? So keep your eye out for moments like that as well. And beyond that, as you read on, notice how the structure of the stories matters because of the characters and who they are. Why does each character choose the story that they choose? And how do they tell those stories? Similarly, how do the personalities of the characters shape the structure of the frame narrative? And how do the personalities of the characters, again, shape the stories that they tell? And then finally, where are the hints of class disruption that you see? And how does Chaucer treat these moments? Does he treat these moments of disruption as serious breaches of the social order? Does he treat them as like these really revolutionary acts? Does he treat them as like moments of comedy? Does he see them as a gentle social commentary? Sort of, how does Chaucer the author, or even Chaucer the narrator, sort of treat these moments of disruption in the social order? So until next time, good luck with the story. If you need me, if you're not sure how to approach this tale, please let me know. I will be here ready to chat about this because it's one of my favorites. Till next time.